Welcome to Module 8. Institutions come and go, or do they? Institutions essentially come in two varieties, as I described them, formal and informal. The Congress, the President, are examples of formal institutions that we all understand as having a foundational role in our American society. Moreover, marriage, church attendance, divorce, trade unions, the Miss America pageant, all of these also have a kind of institutional quality that give us, in the best of times, stability and equilibrium around which we're able to organize and live in society. Without those institutions, we would not be a well-ordered society by definition. This slide shows my little message here. American institutions are the elements of political and social infrastructure that enable us to live our lives with some order. We all understand more or less how the institutions work and how to follow the rules with which most of us agree, most of the time, in most circumstances, depending on the consequences at the time. Americans are shoppers, we are pickers and choosers, and some of us subscribe more strongly with greater devotion to some institutions than others. But these institutions exist for all of us, and in the best of times, they provide that kind of foundation. Now, one of those institutions is faith in America. Not faith in America, but faith in America. Since many years ago, a long time, it's been very difficult for polling organizations to measure religiosity. It is one of the most challenging. One of the few measures that has been used over time, especially by the Gallup organization, has been weekly church attendance. It is just an indicator. It doesn't show whether we are a faithful people or not. Gallup measured a change between 1955 and 1972 in Roman Catholics, and that there was in fact a decrease in weekly church attendance on the part of Roman Catholics. From that high, 1955, when I was a little boy at St. Anthony's Parish, to 1999, when it went down to 45%. Why? I suppose that some would be tempted to say, well, it was the 60s, it was the libertine era, it was rock and roll music. In fact, those may have had some role, but I think the biggest part was really a reaction on the part of American Catholics to the institutional church. Remember, in the 1960s, we had Vatican II, and the Vatican Council was a re-examination by the Holy Father and his successor by Pope John the 23rd and his successor, an examination of what Catholicism was in the world, what our role in the world was vis-a-vis other denominations and other faith institutions, and those changes, including going to the vernacular, saying Mass in English in America and Croatian in Croatia, disoriented a lot of people. A lot of people slid away and chose not to go to church. And I think so it was a reaction to the institutional church. I think a lot of people also examined whether in fact the church in those times was living the gospel in the way that they, the members of the church, would like the church to do. Was the church taking the kind of leadership in all the issues that troubled us in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and throughout, in a kind of exemplary way to follow Christ's lead? Whether or not it did is not my topic today. I'm telling you that people reacted from their visions of what the distance was between what the church did and what they thought the church should do, and they walked away or didn't show up as often on Sundays. Meanwhile, interestingly enough, the mainline Protestant denominations, the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians and the Methodists, they had a little bit of a change from 42 to 45%, and that was about all there was. Now, Speaking of research, market research grew out of behavioralism, and behavioralism was essentially a kind of studied view of individuals making decisions that turned into group decisions. And in fact, it was big during World War II, it was important in our intelligence efforts, but it became applied to marketing after World War II. And this ancient word cohort, which was a Roman fighting unit where the men moved together and fought together and took orders together, was adopted by the marketers as a phrase to describe what went on. Now let's talk about the baby boomers. I'm one of those. I was born between 1946 and 1964. Now, who picked those years? Simply the years are defined by the fact in the post-war era, when all these 12 million men in uniform came back to America to start their families, this marked the ages of childbearing years for their wives between 1946 and 1964. Again, my parents were married May 4th, 1964, and I was born April 16th, 1947. Now, do all baby boomers think alike? No. Do we all move alike? No. Do significant segments of us find appeal in convertible automobiles, in suburban homes, in city living, yes, that much is true. So there is some power to the use of cohorts as an analytical device in predicting behavior, especially in the marketplace. Now, you talk about an American institution, a world institution, you must talk about marriage. And during the 20th century, second half of the 20th century, you must also talk about divorce. We'll look at this chart here and on the next slide. Clearly, the institution of marriage has changed since World War II. Now, you see from looking at this chart, let's take a better look at it here, that right before the war, there were quite a few people who got married. And they knew the war was coming. During the war, they got married. Now, the blue line shows the rate per 1,000 of married women who were 15 years and older. Then you show, on the red line, divorces and annulments in a scale in thousands in the same way. So obviously, those two curves are going to move together. Now, after the war, there was a peak in the number of divorces. And some of the men and some of the women did not choose wisely. They chose hastily, and they divorced. And then, thereafter, it slid down quite a bit. Again, you see this second red dot to the right, 1946, when my folks got married. And then divorce was very, very flat in terms of its rate until about 1966. Now, what happened in 1966? Again, was it the awful lifestyle of the 60s? Was it the hippies, the beatniks, Elvis Presley? What was it? No. What I submit that it was not so much a lack of religiosity, although I'm sure some of that played into it. It was a civil thing. It was a law. It was no-fault divorce laws. And since marriage, in a legal sense, is governed by the state, when states started to adopt these no-fault divorce laws, what they did is they gave people an opportunity to avoid what had been a very complicated civil matter. If you wanted to divorce prior to then, you had to hire a lawyer, go to court, file complaints that alleged all sorts of behavior on the part of your spouse. You and your spouse both have to go to court. There had to be an open hearing of these grievances. There had to be witnesses. There had to be a convincing body of evidence for the judge to grant the divorce. It was a brutal and bitter system. And it was frankly beyond the means of a lot of people. They couldn't afford it. The men couldn't afford it. The women couldn't afford it. And then it became easier in a legal sense. Now, it's not my purpose here in this conversation to say this was one of the darkest days in American history. That's for you to judge. It was, I'm reporting today, a change. As one state, another, and another, and another adopted these laws, there were increasing numbers of people between the late 60s and 1980 and the early 80s who chose divorce as a path out of marriage. You'd go to the court, you would allege one of the recognized causes. You need not have all these witnesses and all the brutal display of your unhappiness in the court. The court would examine the husband, the wife, their material sufficiency. The court would grant either spousal support in the form of alimony or child support, and the property would be divided, and that would be, in the eyes of the law, the end of the marriage. As you look at this chart, you can see that the blue line, the rate at which women aged 15 years old and more were getting married, in fact, decreased slightly and then flattened out for the last 20 years between 1980 and the year 2000. The rate of divorce was, again, pretty much flat from its peak in 1980 and remained flat since then. Now, I dare say that if I asked most of you about the rate of divorce, you would say that it's increasing. It is not, or at least it wasn't at the end of the 20th century. Now, this blue line flatness is explained by a couple of things. One, women were a little more cautious. They were a little more willing to live alone. They were choosing the single life. They just were not entering marriage with the same rate that they did before. So that's how the institution of marriage and divorce changed essentially in the post-World War II era. Now, marriage and divorce. Marriage and divorce are important like labor unions are important, represent a different kind of union. It represents the union of workers. And in fact, late in the 19th century, the modern labor movement in America got started. And workers got recognized as bargaining units, especially during the Depression. And those gains that they had during the Depression stayed through World War II. And whether it was the Brotherhood of Teamsters, which I joined in 1965, or whether it was the rubber workers or the professional air traffic controllers or the steel workers or the firefighters or the candy manufacturers, it was workers binding together to have the right to assert their benefits and their rights in the workplace with the owners of the company. And those federal laws that protected those rights were very important for the establishment of labor unions. Labor unions created, as I observe, along with the GI Bill, the foundation for the middle class in America. My brother married a wonderful young woman who was one of three daughters. Her father worked in the assembly plant on automobiles for his whole life, his adult life, and the mother did not work outside the house. He was able to make a sufficient income with the wages and the benefits that they had to support those three girls, to see those three girls into and through college, and to live a satisfactory life of a family, to go vacation and buy cars and all that kind of thing. Those gains diminished and were lost in the 20th century. The centrality of labor unions, especially in the trades, is gone. And part of the time at which it developed was in the 50s and 60s. States would pass these so-called right-to-work laws where you didn't have to become a member of a union. That was one phenomenon. But the other was in 1981 when Ronald Reagan became president. He did not so much like labor unions, and that was part of the creed of his party at the time. And so when he grew unhappy and the air traffic controllers went on strike for additional benefits and salary, he fired them all. He fired 18,000 air traffic controllers, and the air traffic control centers and the towers in America were empty. Now, I can tell you, I used to travel for business at the time, And I was very nervous about getting on an airplane where there were going to be amateurs doing the air traffic control. Now, a few crossed the picket lines, and the government grabbed a bunch of them from the military. But it takes like 19 months of training to become an air traffic controller. One doesn't just read a manual and learn how to do this. It's a very challenging line of work. Well, eventually they settled, and the air traffic controllers came back. The union was chastened, it was diminished, and I've talked to air traffic controllers in the last 10, 15 years who tell me the irony is that their union is actually back stronger than ever, and so too are their benefits and their pay. So, but other unions are really diminished in their power in the workplace. You look at the change in manufacture, the globalization in manufacturing, the bargaining power of the labor unions was diminished, and their numbers were reduced. One thing you may not know is that a lot of public employees are unionized. Not just the air traffic controllers, but firefighters, policemen, teachers, government workers are unionized. The Postal Service. These remaining unions have incredible strength within those sectors. And that is the way it is, because unions were a reaction to the face of capitalism. Now, capitalism, I want to talk a little bit about the pioneers. Up in the upper left-hand corner of this slide, you see a photo of John Maynard Keynes, the famous Brit. Now, prior to his coming along in the 1930s, the prevailing idea was still Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, and how a mercantile economy should be governed by the invisible hand. That is, if something goes wrong in the economy, a natural equilibrium will develop. If there are too few producers, others will enter the market and become producers. If there are too few customers, they'll become fewer producers. When the Depression, and it was a worldwide depression, came in the 30s, it was clear to Keynes and others that that was not going to be sufficient. We just couldn't wait it out for this invisible hand to create equilibrium again in the marketplace and in the economy. So he suggested that government should take a role, and government essentially did not have much of a role before that. He suggested government had two important tools: fiscal policy and monetary policy. In fiscal policy, the government has the opportunity to spend more or to spend less, and it has the opportunity to change tax rates. Both of those have major impacts on the economy. That's fiscal policy. Monetary policy is when the government changes the amount of money in the system, or in fact changes its cost by changing the interest rate through the Federal Reserve. So these are the two tools: fiscal policy and monetary policy. Franklin Roosevelt read what Keynes had to say. Keynes actually came to the White House and met with Roosevelt. Roosevelt became the first Keynesian president, and it is said that most all presidents, Republicans and Democrats, since have become Keynesians. John Kenneth Galbraith was a giant of an economist in America in the 20th century. He was also a giant. He was about 6'8" tall. Here are some logos of some great American companies, and you see the symbol of the oil drilling company. Now, what in the world is capitalism about? Whenever I ask this question in class, I usually get somebody who raises their hand and says, well, it's about the free market. Well, it may be a little bit about the free market, but that is not a definition of capitalism. Capitalism is defined by, I suggest, these three characteristics. The means of production are held in private hands. Now, what are the means of production? If you own a trucking company, you're going to own a bunch of trucks. You're going to ship freight from place to place. You're going to charge people for that freight. And then the money you get, principle number 2, the profit will return to you because you own the means of production. Pretty simple, including stockholders. If these people invest in your company, then they own a share of your company. And when you get these profits, you'll share it back, either by increasing the value of the stock in the marketplace or by increasing dividends to them. Finally, capitalism depends on a system of money and banking that facilitates the flow of capital. Early in the 20th century, if you wanted to go to, let's say, England and do business, and let's say you ran a company here in Atchison, and you're John Smith and you own this big company, you would go down to the local bank. The local bank would provide you a letter of credit. You would take this to the Bank of England, and you would show this to the Bank of England. The Bank of England would recognize that John Smith is good for a $1 million loan. He's got sufficient collateral. He's got established relationships with our bank. Please extend him this courtesy. Now, you don't have to do that because capitalism is globalized. The flow of investments, the flow of money, the availability of markets, manufacturing is worldwide. Early in the 20th century, we used to be island America. We made all our own shoes, our food, everything that was manufactured. Automobiles was manufactured here in America. Now, American companies have your clothes manufactured abroad because it is less expensive, and they are able to offer you more clothes at a less expensive price, and so you will buy more clothes. You'll buy the sweater in blue and green and gray because you like its style. These are some of the major characteristics of capitalism. Now, there is no such thing as a free market. Free markets don't exist. I mean, 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act, there are laws that govern capitalism. Now, some of the laws govern capitalism better than others, but in fact, the marketplace is regulated. It's regulated by state laws, it's regulated by federal laws, and you know what? If you could get them to talk with you honestly, your friendly neighborhood capitalist would say, we like it that way. It provides us a rule book. Now, some of the rules they submit will be excessive for them, especially rules of safety in the workplace. But the rules describe the dimensions of the marketplace, and that helps protect America from foreign competitions. It helps protect businesses from crossing state lines when they shouldn't. It's really operates as a kind of subsidy for business. Now, let's take the tax law, for example. Let's say you're a big manufacturer, again, and you're in the trucking business, and you want to borrow $3 million to buy new trucks. The tax laws are created in such a way that you get to take that $3 million loan, you get to deduct the interest, you get to amortize the value, the asset value of those trucks over time. So in fact, they provide a subsidy for you. If you didn't have these tax laws, you would make $1 million 1 year, you have to save up the next year to make another $1 million, and then in the third year, when you've achieved $3 million with no particular tax benefits, you go out and buy $3 million worth of trucks. It doesn't work that way. Tax laws and other laws that regulate business also enable business, and some provide direct subsidies for business, but we'll talk about that another time.